We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 36a. The Mishnah continues to list various kinds of wrong intentions that a person might have when slaughtering a carbon. Let's say it's bifnim bachutz. Again, let's say it's a carbon where the blood should be applied within the Beis HaMikdash, and he has intention to do it outside the Beis HaMikdash on the outer Mizbeach. Ve'es hanitonin bachutz bifnim, or again, it's supposed to be a carbon where the blood is applied on the outer Mizbeach, and he has intention to do it inside the Beis HaMikdash. Sheyochluhu tameim. Let's say he has in mind that tameim should eat the carbon. Sheyakrivuhu tameim. Let's say he has in mind that tameim should offer the carbon. Sheyochlu arelim, that uncircumcised people should eat the carbon. V'sheyakrivu arelim, or that uncircumcised people should offer the carbon. L'shaber atzamos hapesach. Let's say he has in mind when he's slaughtering the carbon to break the bones of a carbon pesach. Lechol heimenu no, to eat from the carbon pesach no, which means it's half raw. Ula'arev damo b'dam hapsulim. He has in mind to mix the blood of the carbon with puzzle blood, with disqualified blood. Kosher in all of those cases. When he has these kinds of intentions, the carbon is still kosher. She'ein machshava poselis, because wrong intention only disqualifies. Ela b'chutz lizmano v'chutz l'makomo, only if he has wrong intention for outside of the proper time or outside of the proper place. But these other wrong intentions do not create a disqualification. V'hapesach v'achatos, and when it comes to carbon pesach and carbon chatos, shelo lishman, if he has intention shelo lishman, not for the sake of those karbanos, that also creates a disqualification. And the Gemara says, my time at Rabbi Yehuda, what's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Again, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah said on the previous Amud that let's say a person has in mind when he's slaughtering the carbon to leave over, lahaniach, to leave over the blood or the emurim for the next day. So that does create a disqualification. Also, if he has in mind to take them outside the proper place, that creates a disqualification. That's even though it's not an intention of consumption of the carbon outside the proper time, outside the proper place. It's just an intention, lahaniach, to leave it. That's enough to create the disqualification according to Rabbi Yehuda. And so the Gemara is asking, what's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Trei kroi ksivi, there are two psukim that are written, benosar, with regards to nosar, with regards to leaving over a carbon. Kasav echad omer, one pasuk says, lo sosiru mimenu ad boker, don't leave it over until morning. V'chasav echad omer, lo yaniach mimenu ad boker, there's another pasuk that says the same idea, don't leave it over until morning. What do you need two psukim for? Imeino inyan lahaniach, if you don't have to apply it to lahaniach, Teneu le'inyan machsheves hinuach, then you should apply it to machsheves hinuach. The Gemara means to say, if you're not going to apply, you don't need two psukim, so you don't need the second pasuk for lahaniach, simply leaving it over. So then instead apply it to having intention to leave it over. Intention to leave it over is also going to disqualify from that second pasuk. Rashi explains, Trei kroi ksivi benosar, there are two psukim that are written by nosar, chad bepesach v'chad betoda. One is written by carbon pesach, and one is written by carbon toda. But the Gemara continues and asks, Rabbi Yehuda, hai kro lahachi uda asa, but does Rabbi Yehuda really use the pasuk for this halacha? Again, machsheves hinuach, hai mi boy le'lechidetanya, isn't the pasuk needed for the following that we learned in the following brisa? The pasuk says, uvesar zevach todas shalom, it talks about the meat of the carbon toda. Lamadnu letoda, this pasuk teaches us that the carbon toda shenacheles liyom v'layla, that it's eaten for a day and a night. That's the amount of time you have to eat the carbon toda. Chalifin uvlados temuros minayin. How do we know this is true by the chalifin? That's that which is exchanged for the carbon toda. We'll see Rashi in a moment. And valdos refers to the offspring of the carbon toda, and temuros refers to a person tries to substitute one animal for, he has a carbon toda, he tries to substitute the animal that's a toda with another animal. So the halacha is you're not allowed to do that, but if you try to do that, then the substitute animal and the original animal are kodesh. But how do you know Yom V'Layla applies to all of these as well? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says uvesar, the word uvesar in the pasuk is extra. That comes to include chalipin, valdos, and temuros. Chatos v'yosham minayin. Now, how do we know that this applies to carbon chatos and carbon osham as well? How do we know that they're supposed to be eaten? You have a day and a night. Talmud Lomar zevach, the pasuk says zevach. That comes to include chatos and osham. Uminayin l'rabos shalmei nazir v'shalmei pesach. How do we know also to include the carbon shlamim brought by a nazir, the carbon shlamim of Pesach, that is referring to the carbon chagiga that is brought on Pesach. Talmud Lomar shalamav, the pasuk says shalamav. That includes those types of shlamim as well. Regular shlamim is not a day and a night, it's 2 days and a night, but these kinds of shlamim, shalmei nazir and shalmei pesach, that's also 1 day and a night. And lachmei toda, what about the breads from the carbon toda, v'chalos urekikim a Nazir, and the challah and the wafers by Nazir. Minayin, from where do we know that they're also a day and a night? Talmud lomar karbono. The pasuk says karbono. Kulon kore ani bohen lo yaniach. For all of these karbonos, we refer to the pasuk of lo yaniach. You shouldn't leave it over, and that's how you know. Again, it's lo yaniach mimenu ad boker. The amount of time is going to be a day and a night. And so again, the Gemara's question is, if lo yaniach is meant to teach us this halacha, so how can it also be teaching us machsheves hinuach? And the Gemara continues and answers, imkain, if so, if this was all it was teaching, what this brisa is teaching, so le makra lo tosiru, then the pasuk could have said lo tosiru. My lo yaniach, why use specifically the language of lo yaniach? Emeino inyan lehinuach, if you're not going to apply it for actually leaving it over, we already know that. Teneyu inyan lemachsheves hinuach. So then again, you should apply it to machsheves hinuach, you should apply it to an intention to leave it over. And the Gemara continues and asks, Hateinach l'haniach. Now this is all good as a source for Rabbi Yehuda in terms of intention l'haniach, to leave it over past the proper time. But again, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda also said, let's say the person has intention to take it out of the proper place. Lahotzi ma'ikal memra. What are we going to say by lahotzi? Meaning, what's the source for that? V'yod, and further, it's Haimad Rabbi Yehuda svara, who really the reason of Rabbi Yehuda is not a source from a pasuk. It's actually svara. It's actually a logical argument. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, Amar lahem Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said to them, he said to the Chachamim, Iatem modim, don't you admit she'im hinicho l'machar, that if it actually is left, if the carbon is left until tomorrow, shu pasal, that it's disqualified? So afchishiv l'hanicho l'machar pasal. So too, you have intention to leave it to tomorrow, it should be disqualified. That's really his argument to the Chachamim. It's a logical argument. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella, rather, time with Rabbi Yehuda svarahu. The reason of Rabbi Yehuda is a svara, again, since hinicho l'machar is pasal, so chishev l'hanicho l'machar is also possible. And Rashi explains, Chalip in the exchange, that refers to mafresh todaso v'yavdal. Let's say somebody separates his carbon toda and it gets lost, the animal gets lost. V'hifresh acheres tachteh, then he separates another animal instead. V'nimtzes harishon, and the first one is found. Havishniya chalife toda ukreva, so the second one is considered an exchange of the carbon toda. It's chalipin, and it is offered as a carbon. Valdos tamura, and then the Gemara talked about valdos and tamura again, which is offspring and tamura of toda. That's vlad toda, the offspring of a toda. Muras toda, and again the substitute of a toda. V'kulan craven. All of these are offered as karbonos kedamrin bebechoros, like we say in bechoros. Rak kodashecha. The pasuk says rak kodashecha. Elu hatmuros asher yiyelecha. Pasuk says asher yiyelecha. Elu havaldos. That refers to the valdos. B'chulan ani kore bohen tisa uvasa. All of them are offered. We refer to the pasuk of tisa uvasa. Talmud lomar uvasar. Again, the pasuk has an extra word uvasar. The havalei lemichtav vitodaso. It should have just said it's toda. His toda biyomo yachal is going to be on that day. Havale kra yaser l'drasha. So uvasar is an extra part of the pasuk for a drasha. Shalmei nazir, the carbon shlamim brought by the nazir. That's the ayil nazir, the ram of the nazir. Haton lechem kamosa. You bring bread together with that carbon. It's very similar to the carbon toda, which you bring bread. The shalmei pesach, and the carbon shlamim of pesach. As we said, that's chagigas arba asr. That's the carbon chagiga of Pesach. That's brought on the 14th. Aval shlamim bial malo. But Rashi notes, as we mentioned, a regular shlamim lo matzi l'rabui, that we're not going to include. To haksib behedyabu shnei yom, because over there again it's 2 days. B'yom zivchachem yayachlu mumacharas. That already is learned from the pasuk explicitly. Hachi garsinan, in the proper text is imkain. If so, if it was only teaching us what the brisa teaches, leima kra lo tosiru. The pasuk should have just said lo tosiru. Kedechsib b'chol shar nosarim, lashon nosar. That's always the language that is used by nosar, and so the fact that it uses that language of lo yaniach, that teaches us the second idea as well of machsheves hinuach. But then the Gemara asked, "V'yo time of Rabbi Yehuda al karchach svaru." How can you say the pasuk, the source is a pasuk? It's a svara. V'lome riboy dekra. It's not from an inclusion in the pasuk. Elosvirle dehoelu mifsal behotza. It's just logical, since hotza, since taking it out is a disqualification, uvihinuach, and since leaving it over is a disqualification. So mifsal nami b'machsheves hotza v'hinuach. So he holds it's disqualified also with intention of hotza and hinuach. In other words, anything that creates a disqualification, intention for that creates a disqualification as well. Shem hiniach l'mocher shu pasal. If he leaves it tomorrow, it's pasal. The dam nifsal b'shkiyas chama, because again the blood would become disqualified at shkiyas hacham at the sunset. So since hiniach l'mocher is pasal, the intention for that as well is going to disqualify. That's the actual reason of Rabbi Yehuda. And so the Gemara continues and asks, V'niflog nami Rabbi Yehuda bekulu. If that's the case, if Rabbi Yehuda is just applying a svara and saying that if you do the action, if that disqualifies, then intention to do that will also disqualify. So why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue with in all the other cases of the Mishnah, all those other intentions? He should argue that it disqualifies as well. And to that the Gemara says, Behei niflog. Well, which case in the Mishnah do you think he should argue? B'shover atzamos haPesach. Let's say, for example, breaking the bones of a korban Pesach, or v'lechol mimenu no, eating from the korban Pesach no, meaning again it's half raw. So zivcha gufe mimifsal. Do you think that the korban itself is going to be disqualified retroactively if you break the bones or if you eat from it? No, that's not it's not a disqualification. So you wouldn't apply the logic. Intention for that would not disqualify either. And similarly, al menas sheyochluhu tameim. Let's say it's the intention that tameim are going to eat from the korban. V'sheyak rivu tameim, or that tameim are going to offer the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach. Again, zivcha gufe mimifsal. Does that disqualify the korban? Again, that would be a retroactive disqualification. All of the blood avodos are done. The korban has been accepted, and that's not going to disqualify retroactively. So therefore, intention for that is not going to disqualify as well. Sheyochlu areilim v'sheyak rivu areilim. Similarly, let's say intention that uncircumcised people will eat it, or uncircumcised people are going to offer it. Zivcha gufe mimifsal. Again, is the korban going to be disqualified? It is not going to be disqualified, and so therefore, again, in these situations, intention for these things will not disqualify either. The Gemara says, Lishna Achrin, another version of the above argument we can say is as follows. Kol kamine. Does he really even have an ability for that? In other words, how does a person who's bring a korban, let's say he's doing the shechita, he has intention that it will be eaten by people who are tamei. He doesn't have the power to force those people that are tamei to eat it, to offer it, etc. And so therefore, again, that kind of intention obviously is not going to create a disqualification. And the Gemara continues and asks, La'arev damo b'dam hapsul, and what about the case in the Mishnah where the person has intention to mix the blood with disqualified blood? So there, Rabbi Yehuda l'taimei, Rabbi Yehuda follows his opinion. Diamar ein dam mevatel dam, because Rabbi Yehuda says one kind of blood is not mevatel, doesn't nullify another kind of blood. So again, it doesn't create a disqualification. So intention for that will not disqualify either. And the Gemara continues, Litenes hanitonin lamalo lamata lamata lamala. Let's say his intention to put the blood that should have went on the upper part of the mizbeach on the lower part, or intention on that which should have been on the lower part on the upper part. So there, why doesn't that create a disqualification? Rabbi Yehuda l'taimei, again, Rabbi Yehuda follows his reasoning. Diamar shelo lemakomo nami makomo korina bay. That even if it's placed not in the proper place, that's still considered to be makomo. It's still considered as if it was put in the proper place. So again, if the actual activity doesn't create a disqualification, the intention for that will not disqualify either. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'liflog b'nitanin bifnim shenesanan b'chutz. But why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue in the case where it should have been applied inside, it was applied outside? V'nitanin b'chutz shenesanan bifnim, or it should have been applied outside and it was applied inside the Beis HaMikdash. Why not argue over there? And the Gemara continues and answers, Kasavar Rabbi Yehuda holds, Ba'inan makom shi'ei meshulish b'dam b'basar uve'imur. When it comes to intention to bring the blood to the wrong place, it has to be that you're bringing it to a place that has a threefold function for the blood, the meat, and the emurin. We'll see Rashi in a moment, but the point over here is that inside the Beis HaMikdash is not considered to be meshulish. It doesn't have a threefold function, and therefore intention to bring the blood into the Beis HaMikdash when it shouldn't be brought there is not going to disqualify. But the Gemara asks on that, Umi Islay Rabbi Yehuda Haisvar, does Rabbi Yehuda really hold of this idea of the threefold function? V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Yehuda says, Dover Ra, it says you can't bring this pasuk, the context is talking about not bringing an animal with a blemish as a sacrifice. It says you shouldn't bring anything that's a davar ra, something that is bad, something that is evil on the mizbeach. And riba kan, this part of the pasuk is including chatos sheshachta bidarum. Let's say you slaughter a korban chatos in the south of the Azara. It's supposed to be slaughtered in the north of the Azara, so that's going to be disqualified. And also v'chatos shenichnas damo lifnim psul. If you have a chatos that you bring the blood, we'll see Rashi in a moment. It's talking about intention to bring the blood inside, so it is disqualified. And again, this is inside of the Beis HaMikdash. This is not an area with a threefold function. But the Gemara says to that, V'lesler Rabbi Yehuda shlishi, but does Rabbi Yehuda not hold of the idea of the threefold function? V'atanan, but we learned in the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Hichnis b'shogeg, if he brings the blood in by mistake, kosher, it's still kosher. Ha b'mezid pasul, but if he brings it in b'mezid on purpose, it's pasul. V'kaim ulan b'shekiper, and we've established establish that that's only if he actually applies the blood as an atonement. So hashta now, mahasam aile aila, in that situation where he actually brought it in, keeper in, ilo keeper low, if he applied it for an atonement, then yes, it's disqualified, otherwise not. So hacha dechashav cheshuve here, where he's simply having intention to bring it in, lo kol shekain, isn't it certainly true that it should not create a disqualification, because apparently in order to create the disqualification, it does have to be an intention to bring it to an area which has a threefold function. And to that the Gemara says, Trei Tanoi v'aliv de Rabbi Yehuda. There's a machlokas Tanoim within Rabbi Yehuda whether he really holds of this makom shihei mishulish idea. And the Gemara continues and asks, V'savar Rabbi Yehuda, does Rabbi Yehuda really hold chatas sheshachta bedaram, that a carbon chatas that's slaughtered in the south of the Azor, that is disqualified? And Rashi explains, V'niflog nami Rabbi Yehuda bekulu, if Rabbi Yehuda again holds of this svara, why doesn't he argue in all the cases of the Mishnah? Hoel v'taima mehai svaru, if his reason is from this logic, again, that anything that disqualifies, intention for that disqualifies, so niflog bekulu hanach demasnis, into katani kosher, all the cases of our Mishnah, which say that intention is still kosher, he should argue. And then the Gemara answers, well, which one of the cases specifically do you think he should argue? Mikam mifsal, would it really be disqualified if he breaks the bones of the korban pesach, or he eats the korban pesach when it's half raw? Sheyakrivu tameim mikam mifsal. Let's say again let's say it's brought by tameim. Is that a disqualification? V'hayakrivu, here when we say yakrivu, it's being offered be'imurin kamer. We're talking about offering the emurim, the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach. Dumya diyochlu bebasar, similar to eating the meat. V'cheinim yochlu tameim or arelim zevach. Let's say again, likewise, let's say tameim would eat, or arelim would eat a carbon shenizrak damo kel chasa, where already the dam was thrown properly. Mi pasal a carbon lemafreya mi leratzos. Well, we say that the carbon is disqualified retroactively, that it's no longer accepted. That's not true. So again, since all of these actions themselves do not disqualify, the intention for these actions don't disqualify either. Hachi Garcina, and then the proper text is Lishna Achrina Kol Kamine. Another version of this argument is Kol Kamine does he even have the ability? Mi Yishma Lo Lahakrivo Bipsul HaKohanim Tameim Lo Yishmu Lo. Are people going to listen to him to offer this in disqualification? Tamei Kohanim are not going to listen and offer it. V'chein Ha'arelim, and also uncircumcised Lahakriv L'Mizbeach Ba'Avera. They're going to bring offer on the Mizbeach as in an Avera. They're not going to do that. He doesn't have the power to make them do that. Olechol Kodesh Ba'Avera, to force them to eat the Kodesh Ba'Avera. Hilkachein Machshavto Machshava B'Davar Hatoli Ba'Acherim. Therefore, intention doesn't even count if it's something that's dependent on others. La'arev Damo B'Dam, and then again talking about mixing the blood with pasul blood. Kuli Hai Mishinuya. All of this is part of the answer. Kilomar V'Iflog B'La'arev Dam. If he's going to try to argue by mixing the blood, Ein Dam Mevatel Dam. So even in that case, if you actually do it, it's not disqualified because blood does not nullify other blood. V'Chevan De'erev Lo Pasul. So again, if mixing it itself doesn't disqualify, Machsheves Erev Nami Lo Pasul. So intention to mix also doesn't disqualify. And Rashi continues, Liten Asanitan, and let's say when he's slaughtering the carbon, he has intention to place the blood in the wrong place on the Mizbeach. It should have went on the upper part. He has intention for the lower part. Liflog b'machshava shelo b'makomo. Again, Rabbi Yehuda should argue, intention in the wrong place on the Mizbeach, that should disqualify. And to that the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda l'taimei diyam, Rabbi Yehuda is following his opinion because he says, Afilo yahave chutz l'makomo lo mifsal. Even if the blood was actually placed in the wrong place on the Mizbeach, it wouldn't disqualify. Lo mifsal zivcha milaratzos. The carbon would not be disqualified from being accepted. The shelo b'makomo k'makomo dami, because again, not in the right place is like the right place. By Perek Beis, we said earlier in Perek Beis, to kimna masnisin dechishev litenes anitonin lamata lamala desfir lelatana. The shelo b'makomo k'makomo dami. Again, shelo b'makomo is like makomo. The maskana midi dehavi amachsheves hinuach va'aliva de Rabbi Yehuda. And again, this was following Rabbi Yehuda. This is what we said earlier. And so again, since we said earlier that Rabbi Yehuda holds chutz shelo b'makomo is k'makomo dami. So again, if you actually did it, it wouldn't disqualify. So intention to do it is not going to disqualify. And Rashi continues, V'liflog belitenes hanitonin bifnim b'chutz. Why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue on the case where it should have been brought into the Beis HaMikdash and he has intention to place it on the outer Mizbeach? And Rashi notes over here, V'hanitonin b'chutz shechishev liten bifnim kamakshi. Really the question of the Gemara is focusing on just one of these two cases. It's focusing on the case where the blood should have been on the outer Mizbeach and he intends to bring it into the Beis HaMikdash. That's really what the Gemara is asking, that Rabbi Yehuda should say disqualified with that intention. To hasam vada because over there certainly you have a yoiv chatas hachitzona. Let's say at a chatas that the blood is supposed to be on the outer mizbeach. Bifnim, if he goes and applies it inside the mikdash, mifsala, it is disqualified. That we know is disqualified as an action. Because that's a pasuk. It says any chatas that is brought into the Beis HaMikdash. Again, that's a chatas hachitzona that's brought into the Beis HaMikdash. The blood is brought into the Beis HaMikdash. That's a disqualification. So the Gemara is focusing on that and asking, since that is disqualified, so intention for that should be disqualified. And to that the Gemara answered again, talking about a mokum shihei meshulish, a threefold function. Kasavar Rabbi Yehuda holds machshava litein esanitanin bechutz bifnim, specifically an intention to place the blood that should have been on the outer mizbeach, and you have intention to bring it inside to the inner mizbeach, lo pasla, that kind of intention doesn't disqualify. The gavi machsheves chutz lizmana, why? Because by a machsheves, by an intention of outside the proper time, kasav shlishi, the word shlishi is written. V'darshina, we darshan from there, shi'e oso chutz, mishulish bedam uvasar ve'emurim. We darshan from there that intention of outside the proper place has to be to a place that has a threefold function, meaning it can theoretically function with the avoda of the blood, with the meat and the emur and the sacrificial portions. Dahainu chutz li azara mamish. What kind of place is that? That would be of intention outside of the azara. Meaning, shebeshas heter habamos, meaning at the time when bamos were permitted, so nishtalish b'choleilus, so you could theoretically do the dam, the basar, and the emur, could all be done outside of the azara. Hilkach gezeres hakasav depsul chutz l'mekomo. Therefore, that's the gezeres hakasav, that the disqualification of chutz l'mekomo is again outside the azara. Aval achniso lefnim, but to have an intention to bring it into the mikdash, that's not an area of a threefold function. Lav machshavi, that's not considered to be an intention again outside of the proper place. It's only outside the azara, but not if you have an intention to bring it into the Beis HaMikdash. That is specifically what Rabbi Yehuda holds as far as that case is concerned. Davar ra, something evil, lo sizbach l'Hashem elokecha shor v'seh asher yevo mum. It says you can't sacrifice an animal with a blemish. Riva kan azhar shelo yishchot hachatas bedarim. Now there's an inclusion here. It's a warning. You also shouldn't slaughter the carbon chatas in the south of the azara. And v'chatas shenichnas dam lefnim, and also a chatas if the blood is brought inside. Kilomar, what this means to say is los is bechenu al minas. Again, this part is also talking about intention. Don't slaughter the chatas on with the intention lahachnes dam lefnim, to bring the blood inside. V'lav b'hachnasa mamish kamazrele. This is not talking about actual bringing it in. That's not the warning here. Ela b'machsheves hachnasa. We're talking about intention to bring it in. To have bezvicha kai. How do we know that? Because we're talking about the slaughtering. V'kakari le davaran. We're saying that it's a davarat, something bad. Alma mifsal. We see that we're talking about a disqualification during the process of the slaughtering, and that's with the intention to bring it in. Hichnes b'shogeg kosher. Now, if he brings it in by mistake, it's kosher. B'perakol azvachim shenesarvu. This is in perakol azvachim shenesarvu. V'kaimel and hasan b'gemara b'shili pirkin. We established in the Gemara over there the hadadaikin on hamezid puzzle, that when we say that if it's done b'mezid, it's puzzle. In other words, this Mishnah, which says hichnes b'shogeg kosher, and we infer that hichnes b'mezid is puzzle, that is b'shekiber. That's specifically when the blood is applied as an atonement. B'shanasan mimenu al mizbeach hapnimi. You actually placed it on the inner mizbeach. Hu de kapasel Rabbi Yehuda. That's when Rabbi Yehuda says puzzle, and that means to say it's not simply bringing it in, but the blood has to actually be applied. That's b'shekiber. It actually is applied to the mizbeach as an atonement. That's when it's disqualified. V'lo mifsal b'hachnasa, but just merely bringing it in is not going to create a disqualification, and that's why the Gemara argued. So therefore, intention to bring it in there surely will not create a disqualification. As Rashi continues, V'hashta Umah, now if we're saying that bringing it in doesn't disqualify unless kiper, so again, certainly just intention won't disqualify. We can understand for sure that machsheves hachnasa, just intention to bring it into the mikdash, will not create the disqualification. And so again, we have a contradiction over here. You have this Mishnah which seems to be indicating there is a requirement of a mokom shi'eh meshulash for the intention of disqualification outside of the proper place. And again, we brought a brisa which seemed to say the opposite. So the Gemara said there's a machlokas tanoim within Rabbi Yehuda, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Vav Amid Beis.